2001.
It is lunchtime in London, 5 a.m. in Los Angeles, and 8 a.m. here in New York, live from the CNN Financial News headquarters.
It is beautiful outside, perfect September day with lots of sunshine. Oh, would you look at Washington, huh? I'm going outside today.
Other than that, it's kind of quiet around the country. We like quiet. It's quiet. It's too quiet.
Is that American 11 trying to call?
We have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We're returning to the airport.
The pilot, everyone's been stabbed. They're in the back of the airplane. They're not. Oh, the hijackers are in the cockpit.
Oh, no.
Okay, we just lost connection.
This just in, you were looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
There is a major incident in Lower Manhattan.
We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion at the World Trade Center in New York City.
Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center.
We understand that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center.
We have serious news of a major possible air crash in the United States.
So you saw a plane crash into the side of the World Trade Center?
Yes, sir.
How big, can you tell us? Give us an idea.
It would be hard to imagine that a small plane could create that kind of hole in a building like the World Trade Center.
These buildings are almost a city block size building. This is a large plane.
You're talking about a large passenger commercial jet.
Passenger commercial jet.
The Associated Press is now reporting that it was an aircraft.
Back in the 40s, a plane hit the Empire State Building. In the 60s, a helicopter crashed on the top of what was the Pan Am Building, now the MetLife Building.
Remember, it is shortly before 9 o'clock East Coast time, so we suspect there would have been a great many people in the building and presumably on those top floors as well.
There is considerable and truly terrifying damage on some of those floors at the top.
More than 40,000 people work there, and on any given day, more than 100,000 business and leisure visitors come to the World Trade Center.
All pilots who fly in this area know very well where the World Trade Center is located.
Whenever people for Newark, Kennedy, or LaGuardia, when those planes are put into rotation as they're waiting for landing, they circle around this area, which is right near the Statue of Liberty.
Wind speeds at this point, not tremendous at all. Flying conditions near perfect.
As you can see, this is a clear blue sky day in Manhattan. If this was an accident, it would be a needle in a haystack kind of accident.
I'm afraid we've got a tragedy on our hands.
This is horrible.
Have you seen any evidence, Elliot, of people being taken out of the building? You say that emergency vehicles are there, understandably so, but of course the major concern is human loss.
Oh my God, another plane has just hit. Oh, another one just hit.
Oh my God.
My God.
Just flew directly over my building.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, God.
There's another one.
There was another one.
Running away very, very quickly. There are more explosions further down the building.
Explosion.
The building's exploding right now. You got people running up the street. Everybody's panicking. Clearly the thing is out of control.
One of our producers said perhaps a second plane was involved. You saw a plane?
Yes, I just saw a plane go into the building.
That looks like a second plane.
It could be a 727 right there, maybe even bigger.
This one into the East Tower.
Yes.
I wonder if there are air traffic control problems.
Another passenger plane hitting the World Trade Center. These pictures are frightening indeed.
This is so shocking, of course, to everybody watching.
What we've just seen is about the most shocking videotape I've ever seen.
What are the odds of two separate planes hitting both towers?
And now you have to move from talk about a possible accident to talk about something deliberate.
This has to be deliberate, folks.
Why do you say that was definitely on purpose?
Because it just flew straight into it. It literally flew itself into World Trade Center.
I think we have a terrorist act of proportions that we cannot begin to imagine at this juncture.
Oh my God.
My goodness.
Oh, this is terrifying, awful.
That is a very hard thing to watch.
To watch powerless.
David, we're going to cut you off. President Bush is speaking.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. I, unfortunately, will be going back to Washington after my remarks. Secretary of Rod Page and Lieutenant Governor will take the podium and discuss education. I do want to thank the folks here at Booker Elementary School for their hospitality. Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
Tell me what you know.
Claire, let me interrupt you for a second. We now have fire confirmed at the Pentagon. If John McCarthy at the Pentagon can hear me, John, please get in touch immediately if you can and brief us in there. John McCarthy has actually been evacuated from the Pentagon.
Associated Press is reporting that a plane crashed at the Pentagon.
The heart of the military command center of the United States of America, John. It can't get much worse than this, let's hope.
Claire, what's that we're looking at?
Well, that's what we're trying to figure out right now. It's like nothing I've ever seen.
There's something going on behind the old executive office building.
We are also getting reports now that there is a fire on the mall in Washington. The car bomb has exploded at the State Department.
There is a plane circling the White House at the moment.
A white plane, a very big jet.
The Secret Service was very concerned, pointing up at the jet in the sky.
The Secret Service received what AP is describing as a credible threat of a terrorist attack against the White House itself.
The people who came out were told and ordered by the Secret Service to run.
I'm in front of the Capitol, and a moment ago, police officers ran up to us and told us, and I quote, "There is a plane that has been hijacked and is headed this way."
There has been an explosion of some kind at the Capitol.
And back toward the Supreme Court area, we just heard a low, muffled thud. It sounded like a small explosion. Sirens are going off around this city like you cannot believe.
Now anything is possible.
We want to hold our breath here, it just seems to me, for a second, and not get into a mode that the country is under attack.
We are a nation under siege.
Tell everybody that heightened security is important now.
The word of the day is steady. Steady.
This does seem to be surreal, but in fact it is real.
Whatever is happening and whoever is responsible, we have no way of knowing if it's played out yet or if it's just going on. So every time we hear a plane go by, we wonder what the situation is and where it is headed.
The police have been sent to Union Station. A bomb squad has been sent to Union Station.
Will do right now? I mean, what do you guess is happening and where is it happening?
As the president was on his way back from Florida, we are told by sources a security decision was made that at this time not to bring him back to Washington, so he was brought to one of several military installations in the United States. Vice President Cheney directing operations and monitoring things here at the White House in the White House Situation Room.
From the White House Situation Room, a president or a vice president can direct a war. It is accessible to all information from the United States military, from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, from the Federal Aviation Administration. In this case, the White House Situation Room is a bomb shelter.
That's either U.S. Air Force or Navy aircraft, fighter aircraft, now on patrol, lest there be one more attempt.
2 Navy carrier battle groups, the USS George Washington and the USS John F. Kennedy, are being dispatched out of Norfolk Naval Base right now. They are getting underway and heading up the eastern seaboard.
Wow.
And some people were...
Jamie, I need you to stop for a second. There has just been a huge explosion. We can see a billowing smoke rising.
Let's go to the trade tower again, because, John, we now have a... What do we have? We don't
It looks like a new plume, a new large plume of smoke.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!
We're not sure exactly what happened, but it was another explosion on the far side of one of the buildings from where we're standing. The reverberation and another explosion on the right-hand side.
And I'll tell you that I can't see that second tower, but there was a cascade of sparks and fire, and now it looks almost like a mushroom cloud. What is behind it, I cannot tell you. But just look at that. That is about as frightening a scene as you will ever see.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed. It folded down on itself.
You can see this extraordinary plume of smoke that is, or was at least, the second tower of the World Trade Center. You could, from where we were standing, see that second building, but you can't see it anymore.
There is panic on the streets, thousands of people running up Church Street.
We're talking about massive casualties here at the moment. This is a place where thousands of people work.
Over the police radios among the emergency workers, I can hear them screaming, calling for help at the triage center, where other people who were already injured have been injured more.
We heard a big bang. And then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
Bodies started dropping from the top floors of the tower closest to the highway. Obviously, they had two choices: to be burned in flames or to leap and end it all. It was quite tragic.
Whew. That is extraordinary. My God. Now, anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
This is the scene in Lower Manhattan where these scenes of chaos and utter confusion are just mind-numbing.
The FBI rescue operations and other FBI operations are really in chaos right now because they can't reach their officials in New York. All of their phone lines are down, and now you've got all of their special experts on this stuck in Monterey, California, trying to get a military flight back because there are no longer commercial flights.
At the scene now at the World Trade Center, because of the concerns of the structural stability of the remaining tower, they are now evacuating their own command post and triage center, and they have to find an even further zone to move that to.
Maybe there's three of us in this office. We're not ready to die, but it's getting bad. I understand that. We have everything, sir. I know you do, but it doesn't seem like it. You got lots of people up here. Oh, God!
And there's, you can see, perhaps the second tower, the front tower, the top portion of which is collapsing.
Oh, there it goes, there it goes, there it goes, there it goes.
They seem to have the problem at the north tower.
Oh, my God.
Good Lord. There are no words.
America, offer a prayer.
One has to assume that thousands of lives have been extinguished.
May God help those.
We're being told in Washington.
United 93, go ahead.
Here's the captain. I would like to order to remain seated. We have one more board, and we are going to back to the airport, and we have our demand, so please remain quiet.
Affirmative, he said there was a bomb on board.
Did you hear some interference on the frequency here a couple of minutes ago, screaming?
We have a report that a 747 is down in Pennsylvania.
I'm going to interrupt you, Senator McCain. These are the first pictures we have in. This is from Somerset County, Pennsylvania. This is United Airlines 93. This was a Boeing 757 bound from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco. It crashed in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, near the town of Shanksville.
south of Pittsburgh.
Now in Kabul, I believe.
Sources are telling CNN that there are, quote, good indications that people with links to the Osama bin Laden organization are responsible for today's attacks.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
There is international reaction coming in. Russian President Vladimir Putin expressed his condolences to the American people over the terrorist attacks, calling them terrible tragedies. This from Prime Minister Tony Blair in London. This mass terrorism is the new evil of our world today, he said. It is perpetrated by fanatics who are utterly indifferent to the sanctity of human life. French President Jacques Chirac called it a monstrous attack, expressed his solidarity with the American people. Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and his top aides are following the events from his seaside offices in Gaza City. He says, I send my condolences to the president, the government, and the people for this terrible incident.
World Trade Center. I've heard several reports from several different officers now that that is the building that is going to go down next. In fact, one officer told me they're just waiting for that to come down at this point.
Keep your eye on that building, it'll be coming down. Building is about to blow up. Move it back. All right, guys.
And it sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, just run for your life, just run for your life. And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! There's like a distinct sound. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something.
Where were you on September 11th?
I was home. And the only reason I wasn't where I was every morning subsequent to the 26th day of July, my mornings were spent usually at a breakfast meeting at Windows, an 8 o'clock breakfast meeting, Windows, the top of it, and then going down to visit with my tenants, my new tenants, at the Trade Center, getting to know them, understanding their problems and so forth, ascertaining how we could service their needs better, which is one of the first things you do when you acquire a property. You begin to meet your tenants and start talking with them. And so my mornings were spent at the Trade Center, and then by noon I was back uptown. And so that particular morning, because I have light-colored hair and fair skin, and I'm an annuity to the dermatologist, my wife, God bless her, had made an appointment for me at the doctor. And I remember dressing to go to the doctor. I'm finally saying to my wife, I said, sweetheart, I've got so much to do downtown. I got to cancel this. I've got to go downtown. And she said, you're not going to cancel this appointment. You're going to the dermatologist. And, having been married now to the same woman for 46 years, you get this sense of determination on occasion, their voices. And I said, okay, yes, dear, I'll go. And then just minutes later, received a telephone call to turn on a television set and witnessed this horrendous circumstance. The first plane hitting, and then the second plane hitting. Of course, with the second hit, it became obvious that this was terrorism. I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Hello? Oh, we're getting ready to pull building 6.
Fox News journalist Jeffrey Shapiro confirms that Larry Silverstein had controlled demolition on his mind on September the 11th. and it was no secret to police and others on the ground that day. Shapiro stated that on September the 11th, Larry Silverstein was on the phone to his insurance carrier to see if they would authorize the controlled demolition of Building 7. This revelation causes yet another problem for the official story. How could Silverstein expect to carry out a controlled demolition when it takes several weeks to prepare a 47-story building for demolition?
Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
To me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
September the 11th was clearly a most fortunate day for Larry Silverstein. Not only did he avoid being killed by the attacks, he received a multi-billion-dollar settlement from an insurance policy taken out just a few weeks before. This policy was set up specifically to insure the buildings against destruction via a terrorist attack. This was particularly fortunate, considering the fact that Silverstein was having difficulty in finding new tenants to occupy the buildings at the Trade Center.
My mornings were spent usually at a breakfast meeting at Windows, an 8 o'clock breakfast meeting, Windows, the top of it, and then going down to visit with my tenants, my new tenants, at the Trade Center, getting to know them.
And it was also particularly fortunate, considering that Silverstein had faced the $1 billion requirement of having to remove the illegal asbestos from every steel beam in the Twin Towers. So, if Larry Silverstein's story is true, then he must surely be the luckiest man alive today.
Larry Silverstein. Last time we talked, sir, I asked you if you could address some of the 9/11 conspiracy theories that you were accused of. Sadly, your response has actually invited more of them. I mean, for the record, everybody knows your infamous comments on PBS where you said pull Building 7 on 5/25 on the day of 9/11. Your official response was that it was the firefighters. My question is, it was pretty clear that you meant the building, and if it was the firefighters, they already are outside the building by 12. Because the water lines were broken.
Ask the question.
And the fire chief that you said you spoke to, Fire Chief Negro, denies talking to you on that day of 9/11. Can you answer those questions and address the theories against you?
I suggest, for everybody's consideration, that we all look at the thousands of pages of testimony that have been rendered in the many years since 9/11. And let's use today's session for some of its...
Are you aware of testimony of bombs in the building before the building collapsed, sir? Are you aware of that testimony? Sir, there's testimony by Barry Jennings. Sir, you don't have to touch me. Listen, I'll walk away. All I'm asking is a question. I don't have to be kicked out. It's a legitimate question. You don't have to put your hands on me. But all I'm saying is, no, I'm not. I'm here asking. The question was not answered. That's why I have a grievance. Larry Silverstein was told not to come into work. That's why him, his daughter, and his son never showed up to work on 9/11. He put an insurance policy on the buildings. Reporters, do your job. Please ask some questions. Ask some questions.
The leaseholder of the World Trade Center complex, Larry Silverstein, gave a public interview on PBS in 2002, and he said that they pulled that building, which is a demolition term for intentionally bringing down a building. This man made over $5 billion from those buildings' destruction, And I want to know if there was ever a formal investigation into Larry Silverstein, the leaseholder of the World Trade Center complex, and his ties to this entire event.
I don't believe there's been a formal investigation. I haven't heard that. I don't know that. I do know that that wall, I remember, was in danger, and I think that they made a decision based on the danger that it had of destroying other things, that they did it in a controlled fashion. They did it in a controlled fashion.
We also have the dramatic message left by flight attendant Cece Lyles in her husband's answering machine before briefly talking to him on her cell phone. As she herself is suggesting, we should listen very carefully.
Tuesday, 9:47 a.m.
Hi, baby. Baby, you have to listen to me carefully. I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children that.
We too can notice the absence of the typical background noise heard inside a plane.
I don't know what to say. There's 3 guys. They've hijacked the plane. I'm trying to be calm.
After saying goodbye, she seems to fumble with the headset while she whispers a few more words into the mouthpiece.
I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you. Bye.
End of message.
Even by playing the segment several times, it remains difficult to hear anything different from the words, "It's a frame."
Notice how quickly explosives can transform this 100-story column resembling the World Trade Center into dust. This is exactly what happened on 9/11. High-velocity explosives triggered to cascade in a visual way that makes it look like the building collapsed at free-fall speeds. This is what happened on 9/11. Pay attention to these horizontal ejections. They're a classic sign of a controlled demolition. In this footage, you can see the same types of ejections occurring right around the zone of the collapse. There are multiple examples of this. It gets so sneaky that they let off a few charges as the second plane, Flight 175, hits the South Tower. It's bait and switch, ladies and gentlemen. And as people were looking at the explosion, rocking the South Tower, other explosions were occurring in the other tower. Now, you can deny the evidence if you want to, but one thing is clear. Absolutely everything that has been broadcast since 9/11 has been fake news. Fake news that keep people distracted from what really happened on that day.
You see that blowout? That's a gun.
Imagine the explosive force necessary to blow a person straight out of a window. And it's just that window without any of the other windows or floors being affected. 9/11 deserves a second look. Not only for those that went through it, but for the millions of lives that have been affected ever since. Because if an explosion brought those towers down, then the whole thing's a mass deception. Remember, the people that told you about WMDs in Iraq were the ones who told you who did what on 9/11.
My name is Patrick Dillon. I'm doing this interview because I assigned myself the job after 9/11 to try to find out what actually happened before, during, and after the attack so I could properly identify the people that murdered my best friend, who was a captain, Fire Captain Patrick Brown, who was a Vietnam vet, as I am, 2 tours as a Marine. Became a fireman after he came home and got the call on the morning of 9/11. He had finally got his own firehouse, Ladder 3 on East 13th Street, raced over to Twin Towers. The plane had already hit in the upper part of the building. The elevators weren't working. They ran upstairs with tanks and hoses and began to cut the fire down. And at some point during the early part of that, they radioed to the ground that they had, quote unquote, put the fire out, and it was burned and wounded people inside on the floors that they were working on. They wanted to know from the ground what the orders were to stay up there with the wounded, bring the wounded down. He was trained as a Marine not to leave anyone on the battlefield, so he did not get an answer from the ground because the radios failed miserably.
There were the cheapos that Giuliani would not improve on budget-wise. There were Motorola. They failed on the ground. They couldn't hear them, so they stayed up there. After the fire was out, quote unquote, I heard the radio reports of this. So he put the fire out, so the building does not come down at that point. Something else was brought to bear. The building comes down. In my opinion, thermate was used. I'm working on that kind of evidence.
Could you describe the pile?
The pile was a smoking ruin of steel and piles of concrete, and the air was filled with silica dust and smoke. And the steel, we all kind of noticed but didn't pay much attention to, was in very similar lengths, apparently about 30 feet, and had beautiful 45-degree cuts in them, which we didn't notice that much at that point because we weren't looking for evidence of anything at that point. We were looking for survivors. I was called off the pile to help with a survivor that they were getting out of the South Tower who had survived the South Tower collapse. She was John O'Neill's bodyguard. She was a Czech national who worked for the Port Authority, and she had survived. They were all in the bunker together. Apparently, after the North Tower was hit, they all assembled inside the control bunker underneath the South Tower to see how this was going to progress and what exactly was going on. At one point, before the South Tower had been hit by an airplane, apparently she saw John O'Neill get a cell phone call inside the bunker. He listened to the call, clicked off the cell phone, and then said to everyone else around the bunker command table that, quote unquote, they were controlling the planes from the ground. Someone said this cryptically. I don't know who the phone call was made by. She didn't either. Her boss, John O'Neill, had gotten. And now the background on O'Neill that I know about through my own research and some other, there's a book written about him. He was at some point the FBI's #1 Osama bin Laden hunter. Bin Laden had been identified as an asset who had turned on his masters and had begun helping the Taliban move toward power in Kabul. And John O'Neill and his crew had surrounded them at Tora Bora in the caves and was about to capture Osama bin Laden and was called off the hunt by his superiors in Washington, which made him quit the FBI in disgust and quickly was named then the head of the Port Authority's security systems. Was inaugurated on the night before 9/11 on 9/10 at the Windows of the World, ironically. And he remains a mystery figure in this whole thing because of his connection to Osama bin Laden, who was accused then of quarterbacking the entire attack. John O'Neill is dead. Everyone else in the bunker is dead. She's telling me this story about the controlling the planes from the ground, which was designed as technology to override the fad of hijackings in the 70s and 80s in the Middle East and other places.
When the explosions occurred that killed him, where was his location?
He was in the bunker underneath the South Tower, in the basement of the South Tower, in its own separate area away from the parking lots and the commercial stuff. Command Center it was called, I think, Command Bunker, which is where they all assembled after the North Tower got hit, trying to sift through what exactly was happening. Was this a terrorist attack? Was this an accident? No one really understood or knew at a point within the hour of the first plane hitting what it was, the scope of it, who was involved, or any of that wider information. They were in the dark, no pun intended, for the first beat of this whole thing. What is this? What is happening? Who's doing it? And why? Right? The cell phone call remains for me a key piece of evidence that some quarterbacking was being done, that those planes were not being controlled by 19 inexperienced Wahhabist teenagers, that those nose cones were being guided by someone on the ground, possibly near or in the zone of the terror attack downtown.
But further, you're saying that his telephone call was coordinated with somebody making the decision to
a good person, perhaps, was telling him a piece of information he needed to know, because he had 3,000 or 4,000 people that he had to deal with at that panic moment. You know, do we get him out of the towers? Is this a terror attack? Do we evacuate the towers? All these questions are put in front of him in second to second, beat by beat decision-making crises. You know, and he's in charge. He's the head of security for this, right? Epic, historic moment, right? It changed everything. No one knew what was going on, except people did know what was going on. Was it the Saudis? Was it Saudi intelligence? Was it the Bush administration? Was it Dick Cheney? Was it, the Bush family? No one knew. Well, certainly John O'Neill didn't know because he wasn't part of it. And he was dead within about a half hour because the South Tower came down, killed everybody except this bodyguard. And she's chain smoking and telling me this as she steps down into the subway system, and I've never seen her again. I go back up to the North Tower pile and continue to go down and sift through this wreckage, piercing the voids as the firemen told me to do. Like go down with the harness, drop down lower and lower, find openings in this massive, hot, steaming pile of rubble to possibly find human life, right? I dropped down once into a big void. It turned out to be the part of an office that had kept shape. A room in an office had stayed in its integrity. And I thought I saw office chairs, black office chairs. And I looked more closely at them, and they were human beings that were charcoal broiled from massive amounts of heat. And that's not fire or heat, it's something else. Some major thermate or thermite kind of heat cooked these people to the point that they look like briquets preparing for a barbecue. I raced up from there, started screaming about this to get body bags, and stumbled down off the pile and saw people coming in out of the Building 7 lobby, and stumbled into the lobby of the building like I am now, choking and spitting up, silica and dust, and I was feeling like my lungs had become a couple of bags of concrete. And I sat down inside the lobby with a bunch of other first responders who were also just shaking their heads and covered in dust and spitting out the poisons and just shaking their heads and wondering, like, what are we doing? What's going on here? And we just sat there shaking our heads. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Then a crew of battalion chiefs, big shots, come into the lobby. And my father was a battalion chief, and I knew what they looked like because they have the white hats with the gold band across the hat. My father had retired, but I knew what they looked like because they were big fellas, big Irish-looking, red-faced battalion chiefs. And they come into the lobby with bodyguards who were dressed in black with black ski masks and Uzis. And they said to us, everybody out of the lobby, we're pulling the building, right? Ordering us out. And in demolition terms, pulling the building means demolishing the building. We are demolishing the building. And as you may have seen, Larry Silverstein says the same thing on film after a phone call from one of the people in the fire department. They told me they had to pull the building to avoid more loss of life. And he used the same term, pull the building. We leave the building, and I start going back up to the point where I was working on the North Tower pile across the street, and I turn around and we see Building 7 just settle perfectly into a Houston Astrodome-like footprint of its own. And it was demolished and fell at free fall speed, 5.6 seconds, into its own footprint. Didn't topple over, didn't explode, was never hit by an airplane, was never damaged much. There was a couple of little office fires on the 13th and 33rd floors. That was the extent of Building 7's raison d'etre for demolition. And it was demolished, as this deathbed confession refers to, by the CIA spooker who is an expert in demolition and explosives, who claims on his deathbed to have been the guy to do the job. in the 4 months preceding it, and was worried at the time that it looked too much like the Houston Astrodome and too professional. But that got blown past, and of course no one ever said a word about Building 7 in the 9/11 Commission report. No one ever explained why it went down or what brought it down. It just was ignored, as was a ton of evidence that would have indicted Washington itself for the killing of Jack Kennedy. It's the lie of omission. I watched that happen and continued to dig and never found my best friend. He was found 3 months later without his head. They identified him because of his bunker gear with his name on it. When they brought him out, his other best friend identified him, and they said he still had the bulldog chest of a Marine. I have spent the years since then trying to assemble evidence surrounding an indictment of the real killers of Patty Brown, and I will continue to do that, whether it puts me in jeopardy or not. I don't care. I want to find out who gave the orders, who designed it, who quarterbacked it, and then who was the contract assignees, the paid assassins of my best friend and almost 3,000 innocent civilians. Patty Brown's radio reports are part of the record, and I can hear him. We put the fire out. We put the fire out. The fire's out. We got hurt people up here. We got burned people up here. Over. Like that, you know. What do we do? What do we do? Come back, come back. And he's pretty frantic, but he's clearly Patty asking for, there's a chain of command, and he's asking them for permission to bring them down and get them out of harm's way, or what? Tell me what to do. He's asking the higher-ups, as he should. He wasn't a battalion chief, he was a captain. Putting the fire out means no pancake theory is possible. The steel isn't weakened by intense heat, as the pancake theory is told. No one on the ground after both towers came down saw one stinking piece of steel to support the cores. The cores of these two were built very, 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 strong to withstand hurricanes and 2 airplane impacts. The cores were blown out and disappeared along with everything else. Right? The cores were steel, like 4 feet by 4 feet steel columns going all the way up through the towers. Not a bit of that was left after either tower came down. They were blown up. They weren't melted by anything known to man except planned and painted thermate or all kinds of other stuff that's brought into bear when you were trying to take something that big out. The cores were gone. Just see the steel cores of them standing there like skeletons. They were gone. By what force? Thermate, it's called. It goes from 0 to 3,000 degrees in about 3 seconds, and it melts and cuts steel like butter. But it has to be thought out and thought through and applied to the cores.
Now, I often explain to people that the way the buildings were built, they built the cores first, and in the corners of the cores, they attached cranes, and they built the building around them.
That's right.
The elevator shafts were among the cores.
That's right.
And therefore, demolition crews riding atop elevators would have access to the core columns in the corners of the elevator shafts, so they could attach thermate cutting charges every 30 feet to accomplish this convenient 30-foot length for quick loading onto flatbed trucks. And in fact, you saw these 30-foot lengths all over the place.
That's what happened. What you're describing isn't theory. That's what happened, right? Every single first responder that I know reported multiple explosions throughout the whole building, especially down at the bottom where the base of the buildings are. Multiple explosions were reported. Boom, 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 boom. One of the firemen goes, Preset, these are designed to weaken a 1,000-foot structure, and have it go down once again into its own footprint. Both of them, And every single building employee that I talked to and news media talked to said things were going on in the 6 months previous to that where they would shut the whole power system down of the entire towers on weekends. No one would tell us what was going on. People were coming in and out with no IDs and stuff like that was actually happening, And the employees would ask questions, and then they were told to, just shut up and do your job, So who was that? Was that Securitech? Was that Marvin Bush's company? Was that Controlled Demolition, the contractor? Who was that, and what was going on? Is the essence of who did it. If you follow it that way, as evidence and as a journalist would, as I'm trying to do, eventually you get to the green light crew in the Star Chamber of what? Washington or some other ruling establishment that comes from on high with the orders to execute whatever it is, the project for a new American century. The oil paradigm has to remain central to our gravy train. We have to rationalize a Reichstag fire or some other Pearl Harbor-like attack to go into the Middle East and take all of that hostage again, including all the dark metals that are now being talked about in Afghanistan. All of the metals used for the cell phones and the laptops and all of that technology requires metals that are sitting in Afghanistan in raw form right now, to the tune of $15 trillion, according to the CIA. The CIA also did the studies to put numbers on the amount of oil still in the ground in Iraq and the rest of the Middle East, to the tune of 300 billion barrels still there, and they had to figure out how to eliminate solar and other forms of wind power and sustainable power in order to maintain their economic grip on the global economy, and do it in a way that terrorized the American people and put half of them in uniform going after another shibboleth made-up enemy called the Arab. The Arab, a Muslim, the Islamo-fascist. And it's still being shaped and organized by Trump and his crew. Lee Harvey Oswald, Sirhan, James Earl Ray, Osama bin Laden. This is the template. Hanging on a patsy and enrich the patsy with all kinds of anti-American and un-American salsa, and you've got a goose-stepping population falling right in line with the Kool-Aid of the moment.
Now, you, again, were a witness at Ground Zero.
I got there about an hour after the towers came down.
Okay.
Because I got the call. Patty was in the North Tower.
And you were saying that there was regular 30-foot length steel around.
There was big pieces, uniform length. We noticed that.
What else was there and what wasn't there? There wasn't stacks of floors.
No, there was mountains of dust, mountains and clouds of pumice and silica and concrete in fine form that only could have been created by extremely powerful explosives. Not collapse. No steel building has ever collapsed because of fire, including the one in London, including any other in recent history. They don't fall down from fire.
Could I offer a little change in language? A lot of times people talk about the steel columns being exploded, but cutting charges don't explode, they just cut. They can have electric controls?
They are
Or
controlled by wire sparks. Ignite the thermite.
And the thermite reaches a very high temperature.
3,200 degrees.
Even higher sometimes,
Even
4,300.
higher, right. Cut steel.
And steel melts around 2,800.
Right.
So they slice right through. There was lots of explosions as well. The explosions were for the other stuff besides the steel. The concrete flooring apparently had been sprayed with this super explosive nanothermite.
Okay, you may know more than me, and God bless you. You're going to maybe help me find the killers of my best friend.
Nanotechnology started about 40, 50 years ago, that they discovered that if they applied lasers to make stuff smaller than ever before, that chemical processes could be changed with lasers by making the participating parts of the chemical process small. Thermate is aluminum and ferrous oxide rust. And when they combine aluminum and ferrous oxide, the oxygen goes over to the aluminum, forming aluminum oxide, and you get pure ferrous, pure iron, at a temperature of 4,000 degrees, 3,800 degrees, some very high number. And they used that way back in the 1890s to weld the railroad tracks together. And they could just put the aluminum and the rust together in sand and around both ends of the steel, and the temperature would get hot enough and they would fuse.
Because we saw molten steel. The further down you went into the piles, we saw more and more. It was like one of those documentaries about volcanoes. Molten steel, and almost white hot, running almost like water through parts of the lower end of the pile. And that stayed that way apparently for weeks and weeks afterwards. And peripheral things are there, the 30-foot lengths, which had these beveled edges at 45-degree angles lying all over the place. We didn't say, hey, look at that, that's really weird. They're all the same length and they're all cut like that. Although we were moving them, like 30 or 40 of us would pick one of these things up just to continue to try to dig through it to hopefully find firemen or civilian survivors. We had our hands on this stuff, and we were feeling and then seeing the molten metals. And I had blisters all over my face. The further down I went into the tower pile,
the heat was getting
the heat was hundreds of degrees coming up from this roaring furnace of molten iron, if you will, from underneath the North Tower. And it blistered my face. A friend of mine who was a line producer at CNN, on the afternoon of 9/11, she was there at the headquarters on Columbus Circle, and she witnessed the government officials who showed up and took the top dogs at CNN into a room and marched them out an hour later with that look on their face. And she said, anecdotally later on, that they were told that they are not to report a single thing about the attack until it was approved by Washington. And that's one thing that she told me she witnessed, that there was a media coup d'état had occurred, and she saw it. I brought interviews and evidence of the evacuation of Saddam Hussein from the Baghdad, from the airport, from Saddam Hussein Airport on April 9th of 2003.
Oh.
A witness who was a member of the military, who was the concrete specialist at the airport, maintaining the airstrips for Saddam, witnessed a ceasefire that was called between the Americans and the Iraqi army, while a motorcade of Cadillac limousines, stretch limousines, rolled into the airport while the CIA was landing these unmarked C-130s. The tails go down, and the Cadillacs are driven right into the tails, and they take off. And he saw this happen, and I have him on film. And I brought that film interview to CBS, to a producer there. And I started showing it to him, and after about 20 minutes of showing him this stuff, including the secret weapons that were used to melt passenger buses, the Iraq war theater was used as a testing ground for postmodern weapons. really futurist stuff. And he stopped me and then said, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the building. You'll be escorted out of the building. Please turn that off. And if I show this to anyone else, I will lose my job. So goodbye. And that was one lesson of many lessons I've received when I bring radioactive evidence to corporate media and how it's handled. It's handled sensorially, and once again, it's called the lie of omission. You know, what people don't know is what is killing them.
CIA agent makes a confession on his deathbed. Quote, "We blew up the World Trade Center 7 building on 9/11. Looks like they're all coming out of the woodworks, ladies and gentlemen. Before they die, they have to alleviate their conscience, if you will. 79-year-old retired CIA agent Malcolm Howard has made a series of astonishing claims since being released from the hospital in New Jersey on Friday and told he has weeks to live. Mr. Howard claims he was involved in the controlled demolition of World Trade Center 7, the third building that was destroyed on 9/11. Mr. Howard, who worked for the CIA for 36 years as an operative, claims he was tapped by senior CIA agents to work on the project due to his engineering background and early career in the demolition business. Trained as a civil engineer, Mr. Howard became an explosives expert after being headhunted by the CIA in the early 1980s. Mr. Howard says he has extensive experience in planting explosives in items as small as cigarette lighters and as large as 80-floor buildings. The 79-year-old New Jersey native says he worked on the CIA operation they dubbed New Century between May 1997 and September 2001, during a time he says the CIA was still taking orders from the top. Mr. Howard says he was part of a cell of 4 operatives tasked with ensuring the demolition was successful. Mr. Howard says the World Trade Center 7 operation is unique among his demolitions, as it was the only demolition that we had to pretend wasn't a demolition job.
Of exactly what happened inside the World Trade Center when that first plane went in, and of course the collapses since then. We're going to bring more of those to you now. Barry Jennings, you were on the 8th floor, you work for the City Housing Department. Explain to me the moment of impact.
Well, me and Mr. Hesh, the Corporation Counsel, were on the 23rd floor. I told him we got to get out of here. We started walking down the stairs, we made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. And I turned to Hesh, I said, this is it, we're dead. We're not gonna make it out of here. I took a fire extinguisher and I bust the window out. That's when this gentleman here heard my cries for help. This gentleman right here, and he kept saying, stand by, somebody's coming to get you. They couldn't get to us for an hour because they couldn't find us.
You thought that was it?
I thought we're dead. I thought that was it. I started praying to Allah, I said, that's it, we're gone. It's over.
What was it like for you? You were inside there as well.
It was pandemonium. I mean, it was something like out of Bruce Willis' Die Hard movie. He was there and he was crying, and there was another gentleman crying and for help. We couldn't get to him. We tried to get through we went through the buildings. We were lost. Both staircases, the backside was completely blown away. There was no way to access us. We couldn't get to him. And finally, one of the fire department teams found him. But we didn't think they were going to make it.
Well, certainly you got out. Many others didn't. Of course, we don't have a number right now of fatalities or injuries, but I want to translate a story to you that another man told me. He was near the building. He was on the lobby level, near the shopping area, near the promenade. The elevator doors, he said to me, blew open. And when the doors opened, there was a man on fire inside that elevator. That is the kind of tragedy we are talking about here, and where the World Trade Center...
Hi, my name is Barry Jennings. I'm 52 years old. I've worked for 33 years at one location. When the Office of Emergency Management did an activation, they always included our locale. And what they did was monitor the emergency. They actually coordinated the emergency through several agencies. I received the call shortly after the first plane hit. I got there, I had to be inside on the 23rd floor when the second plane hit. Upon arriving into the OEM EOC, we noticed that everybody was gone. I saw coffee that was on the desk. Still, the smoke was still coming off the coffee. I saw half-eaten sandwiches. And only me, Mr. Hess, was up there. After I called several individuals, one individual told me that to leave and leave right away. Mr. Hess came running back in and said, we're the only ones up here, we got to get out of here. He found the stairwell. So we subsequently went to the stairwell and we're going down the stairs. When we reached the 6th floor, the landing that we were standing on gave way. There was an explosion and the landing gave way. And I was left there hanging. I had to climb back up and now I had to walk back up to the 8th floor. When I made it to the 6th floor and there was an explosion, the explosion was beneath me. Keep in mind now, it's pitch black in there. All the lights went out. So when the explosion happened, it blew us back. I'm thinking I'm standing on the landing. I'm actually holding on to a pole above us. Really? And I had to climb back up because Hess is yelling, what do we do now? I said, there's only one thing we can do and it's go back up. Both buildings were still standing. Keep in mind, I told you the fire department came and ran. They came twice. Why? Because building tower 1 fell, then tower 2 fell. And then when they came back with all concern now, like to get me the hell out of there. I was trapped in there for several hours. I was trapped in there when both buildings came down. All this time, I'm hearing all type of explosions. All this time, I'm hearing explosions. When they finally got to us, and they took us down to what they called the lobby, because I asked them, I said, when we got down there, I said, where are we? He said, this was the lobby. And I said, you gotta be kidding me. It was total ruins. Total ruins. Now keep in mind, when I came in there, the lobby had nice escalators. It was a huge lobby. And for me to see what I saw, it was unbelievable. And the firefighter that took us down kept saying, do not look down. And I kept saying why. He said, do not look down. And we were stepping over people. And you know you can feel when you're stepping over people. This big giant police officer came to me. And he says, you have to run. I said, I can't run, my knees are swollen. He said, you're gonna have to get on your knees and crawl in. He said, because we have reports of more explosions. And that's when I started crawling. And I saw this guy fall behind me and his comrades came to his aid. They dragged him to safety. I'm just confused about one thing and one thing only. Why World Trade Center 7 went down in the first place. I'm very confused about that. I know what I heard. I heard explosions. The explanation I got was it was the fuel oil tank. I'm an old boiler guy. If it was a fuel oil tank, it would have been one side of the building.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building. But then another plane hit the other building. But when I was coming through the doors on the other side of the Trade Center, something, either they blew the lobby up or something, because it blew the glass out of the doors and knocked us all down.
You're in the building trying to help people, and it's exploding on your side of the building. So I don't think it get any worse than this.
It wasn't from the jet fuel. No way.
People don't understand. There may be more. Any one of these fucking buildings can blow up. This ain't done yet. See the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents. Towers. A huge explosion now. All of us.
My name's Tom Sullivan. I worked for Controlled Demolition Incorporated, CDI, the top-rated explosives demolition firm in the world, owned by the Loiseau family during the years surrounding 9/11. And I worked for them as an explosives loader for 2.5 years. As an explosives loader, my job was to place explosives in the buildings to prepare them for demolition. There are many steps that you need to take. First off is you have to weaken the building. To weaken the building, that means the staircase, all the staircases have to be cut at intervals. The firewalls have to be removed. The elevator shafts have to be cut.
I looked down to my right, and the elevators exploded, something out of like a Bruce Willis Die Hard movie. People just come running out of the elevators on fire, fireball. I mean, it was like, what is going on here? There's something's up here. I mean, the plane's up there, now there's fire down here.
Then you have to move to the support columns on the particular load floors, and those are cut by a torch for two reasons. First, to weaken them, and also to allow for charges to be placed onto the structure, onto the columns themselves. And that essentially reduces their strength by about 20%. And even with all of that work being done to weaken this building, it still remains safely standing, so we can continue to work in it. The story that just a few columns can cause a synchronized global collapse, an implosion, is, well, that's just nonsense. I don't see how this could actually happen in real life. When we load a building, we have to have all the support columns on a given load floor fail at the same time, within milliseconds of one another. And therefore, the entire building comes down in a synchronized implosion. So I think this notion of a one column failure causing an entire building to implode in a synchronized fashion is just nonsense. Looking at the building, it wouldn't be a problem once you gained access to the elevator shafts.
How about an elevator modernization, which we know was going on the 9 months prior to 9/11? Yes, Elevator World, March 2001 documents it. In fact, they were in the middle of this modernization. There are people who noted that the elevators were locked in turn and that there were guards placed at these locked elevators during the modernization. Of course, you would have to have access to security. Securicom was brought in. Who sits on the board of Securicom? Marvin Bush, the younger brother of George Bush.
Then a team of loading experts would have access to all the core columns and beams. The rest could be accomplished at that point by just the right kind of explosives for the job at hand. The choices are many out there. You wouldn't need miles and miles of det cord. You could have used wireless remote detonators, and they have been available for years. You need to only look at an action movie to see them in use, and of course the military has them as well.
You want to call your mother or something?
Contractors don't use them, on the other hand, because they're just too expensive. Well, you wouldn't have found steel casings to be left in the rubble. They haven't been used for years. What we use now is RDX copper-jacketed shape charges, and when they're initiated, there's nothing left of those charges. And in the case of thermite, well, thermite self-consuming cutting charges have been around since they first patented in 1984. So there would be nothing left in the debris pile except some residue of molten iron.
Get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
These incredibly hot areas were found at the bottoms of the elevator shafts, down 7 basement levels. The molten steel was found 3, 4, and 5 weeks later when the rubble was being removed. He said that molten steel was also found at World Trade Center 7. The highest temperature was in the east corner of the South Tower, where a temperature of 1,377 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded. The molten steel in the basement was more than double that temperature.
With any implosion, you don't hear one massive boom sound. What you do hear is smaller explosions going off. Mr. Sunder of NIST has said that you would, if this had been a controlled demolition, you would have heard a large, massive bomb going off.
The World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents.
What in reality happens with a controlled demolition is you hear a successive, progressive, smaller waves of smaller explosions going off. In the case of thermite cutting charges, you would have heard far less noise, since they are worked by thermal heating, melting of the steel, rather than an explosive cutting as in RDX charges. I knew from day one that this was a controlled event, and why I did that is because simply looking at Building 7, you have a sudden collapse of the building. It's fairly symmetrical as it comes down. There's the classic kink, which means that the center core fails first, and you can see that on the video, and the building falls near free fall. So I really honestly didn't believe this from day one, because this is the way buildings classically come down with a controlled demolition.
This material is not normal thermite. That's the other thing that really needs to be understood. Anybody could make normal thermite. You can get the ingredients, you can mix them together, you can make them. Any kid could basically do it if they knew the recipe. This material is composed of, the real key ingredient that I don't think anybody else could really make in a convenient way is the nano aluminum. It's a controlled substance. I could go buy it, but the government limits how much I can buy of it. It's very, very difficult to produce in these sizes and to keep from reacting. It's not something that you just get at the local 5 and dime or you're going to make on your own. It's a very, very difficult to make material. And that's the one thing in there that really tells me specifically that this wasn't some guys working in caves in Afghanistan, or it wasn't you know, somebody in their basement doing this. This was, you know, a massive engineering operation that made these materials. So the military uses it for a number of different applications. Another one, if you do a search on Google for thermite and building demolition, you can find all sorts of wonderful devices that have been fabricated and invented that use thermite for building demolitions. An example would be that in 1984 there was a patent issued for thermite cutter charges to be used in building demolitions that could shoot molten iron through the structural steel in milliseconds.
bomb that did that. There's no goddamn way that could have happened.
You can imagine when you assemble these chemicals on a large scale, the amount of heat that you generate.
The Republican Party, clear enough for people to see, and start re-energizing the Democratic base has been pretty much lost for a generation.
The Senate has a grave duty to insist on a full debate that examines for all Americans the full range of options before us and weighs those options together with their risks and costs.
And after he got done speaking, he come over to me, or come down, and he said, "Pat O'Reilly, my friend." And he gave me a big hug, because he's a wrestler. Each time he'd give you a hug, he'd just kind of take your breath away. He'd squeeze you so tight. But that was his way of being nice to people.
How is it that the main voice of opposition just vanished, just disappeared, just suddenly kind of like dropped out of the sky and died for no reason, and there never, ever, ever was a comprehensive investigation, and the political destiny of the country changed?
He would have called for a vigorous investigation of 9/11. He was opposed to cover-ups. He wanted transparency in government. He believed in democracy. He was the most aggressive, consistent, reliable critic of the Bush administration during the history of its existence.
He had Halliburton in court, and that he was standing against the multi-billion-dollar profits of the Iraq war machine.
He certainly wouldn't have been in the pockets of the pharmaceuticals and people that are running the country.
And Wellstone, if you look at where he comes from, he was the most politically progressive member of the U.S. Senate, yet he came from a swing state that goes either way, Democrat, Republican.
The re-election of Paul Wellstone, when the anti-labor groups threw everything, the pharmaceutical companies, the oil companies, the big HMOs, when they threw everything they could at him, when we would have won that, and we would have won that election.
It was only 10 days before the election. Paul Wellstone had been pulling ahead. He was 6 or 7 points ahead of Norman Coleman, the former mayor of St. Paul, who was the hand-picked candidate of the Bush administration.
The calls were made from Washington. George Bush, Dick Cheney, Karl Rove decided that Coleman was going to be the candidate to run against him.
With the loss of Paul Wellstone, a lot of people feel the Democrats lost what could have been the most vibrant presidential candidate, somebody who could have clearly articulated a difference.
There have been questions raised about the consequences of our actions here at home. Of greatest and of gravest concern, obviously, are the questions raised about the possible loss of life that could result from our actions. The United States could post tens of thousands of troops in Iraq, and in so doing, we risk countless lives of United States soldiers and innocent Iraqis.
It was a major, political earthquake, and it happened, it happened with a mysterious small plane crash.
For us to lose Senator Paul Wellstone as a leader and as a person is devastating. But for us to lose Sheila, Marcia, his dedicated staff, and 2 pilots makes our already heavy hearts even sadder.
10 days later, when the plane crashed and they said Wellstone was killed, I immediately felt sorrow for all the people in the whole United States and the world, because here's the one man that had the compassion in the heart. I knew they killed him.
On March 10, 2009, at the University of Minnesota Great Conversations event, investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, in response to a question from University of Minnesota political scientist Larry Jacobs, spoke of an ongoing covert domestic military operation that he called an executive assassination ring.
Things happen. And do they continue to happen to this day? Yep. After 9/11, I haven't written about this yet, but the Central Intelligence Agency was very deeply involved in domestic activities against people they thought to be enemies of the state without any legal authority for it. They haven't been called on it yet. That does happen. Right now, today, there was a story in the New York Times that, if you read carefully, mentioned something known as the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC it's called, is a special wing of our special operations community that is set up independently. They do not report to anybody except in the Bush-Cheney days, they reported directly to the Cheney office. They do not report to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or to Mr. Gates, the Secretary of Defense. They report directly to him. Congress has no oversight of it. It's an executive assassination wing, essentially. And it's been going on and on and on.
Dick Cheney personally warned him that if he opposed the administration, there would be severe ramifications for him and for the state of Minnesota.
He said, Paul, how was your week? And he said, my week was tough. The Vice President Cheney called me in and told me get on their bandwagon or there'd be serious ramifications in Minnesota. And he said there is a lot of things that just don't add up.
And just today in the Times, there was a story saying that its leader, a 3-star admiral named McRaven, ordered a stop to certain activities because there were so many collateral deaths. There were so many collateral deaths.
We were having a convention in the fall conference 10 days prior to Wellstone being killed. The guest speaker was Paul Wellstone. When he got done speaking, there were 350 veterans at the convention, all stood up and gave him a standing ovation. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was a very good speech. Paul went and shook every single person's hand there and gave them each 2 or 3 minutes. He was there for over an hour and a half. He came down and I asked him how his week had been, and he said his week had been tough. The Vice President Cheney called me in and told me get on their bandwagon or there'd be serious ramifications in Minnesota. And to stop sticking my nose into the 9/11, when he made the statement to us about Dick Cheney calling him in, there were about 10 veterans standing around with us. He knew then at Wilmer that the 9/11 was staged. I believe that Wellstone was after 9/11. He spoke about the 9/11 to the veterans. And then when I spoke with him, he said, Pat, there are so many things going on in 9/11 that just don't make sense. We're going to get to the bottom of this. There is something going on. It is being portrayed, it's being blown out. And he said, we're going to get to the bottom of it. I think Paul realized that they had threatened his life, but he didn't want to share that with us. He said, Paul, aren't you afraid? And then he hesitated, and He looked away, and then he came back, and he gave me a kind of a grin. He said, Pat, they're not that much good out here in rural America anyway. And he was gone.
The key in an assassination is not killing the man. It's not even killing the President of the United States. Almost anyone could do that if they were willing to give their own life in the process. The hard part is covering it up.
I didn't expect immediate follow-up, but I definitely expected some kind of a letter or something saying that this was investigated. There's no validity to it. Yes, I did expect something. You know, I don't know what to say. I just don't know what to say because there's never been anything, and I don't think everything's been investigated.
Paul Wellstone would want us to have got to the truth about what happened to him, his wife, his daughter, his aides, and the 2 pilots who may in fact have done everything they could possibly do to keep that aircraft in the air.
And then one other very dramatic thing that our local troops are doing, and believe it or not, at the request of the White House. This is what's so interesting about living and working in Washington, D.C. The mayor called upon the Army National Guard to do several things, and the White House also called out the D.C. Air National Guard. Earlier today, an F-16 fighter aircraft from the 113th Wing of the D.C. Air National Guard was actually called upon to intercept a second aircraft that was perceived to be yet another threat to the Pentagon. They aren't giving any details as to exactly how they deterred that plane. Perhaps they'll be able to share that with us as the days go by and it's not such a sensitive situation. But in any case, it is possible that there was a second aircraft that was headed toward the Pentagon, and because of the D.C. Air National Guard, that situation was taken.
Imagine the kind of world we would face if the people who bombed the Westfall in Mosul, or the people who did the bombing in Spain, or the people who attacked the United States in New York, shot down the plane over Pennsylvania and attacked the
June 22, 2009, 2 Red Line Metro trains collided near the Fort Totten stop. 9 people died, 80 were injured in the deadliest crash in Metro's history. But closure isn't easy for Claire Worley. Her brother, Major General David Worley, and his wife Ann were headed home after volunteer training at Walter Reed to help wounded soldiers. Claire is frustrated. Metro still hasn't completed the safety recommendations from the NTSB.
We're also closely following a developing story from Ohio tonight. A small plane registered to a Buffalo attorney has crashed near Cleveland, and there are no survivors. News 4's Michelle McClintock is live in the newsroom with the latest on this. Michelle.
Well, the names have not officially been released, but the plane is registered to a well-known Buffalo attorney who friends say was always seen flying. Investigators say the plane took off around 4 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon.
This was a small single-engine aircraft, a Cirrus SR-22, that had departed Cuyahoga Airport en route for Buffalo, New York, but crashed shortly after departure, crashing approximately 3 miles from the airport.
According to the FAA, that Cirrus SR-22 plane was registered to Michael Doran, who is an attorney in Buffalo with the law firm Doran and Murphy. News 4 legal analyst Terry Connors says that Michael Doran is the kind of attorney that everyone respects.
Mike was a hard, tireless worker, and he represented hard-working men and women. I know he advocated on behalf of a number of individuals who had sustained hearing loss, to the extent that he made landmark cases.
Connors says it wasn't unusual for Doran to be in Cleveland, as he had many railroad clients there. Doran was involved in many cases involving railroads. According to authorities in Ohio, it was raining and there was low visibility at the time of the crash. Reporting live in the newsroom, Michelle McClintock, News 4 at 11.
Planning to commit suicide?
No, I'm not planning to commit suicide. I'm planning to go into court on April 7th if indeed we do have the trial, and I plan on defending myself vigorously, and I plan on exposing the government in ways that, I do not think they want me to expose them. I want them to explain to me in open court why they came after me.
I mean, how would you not know that it was Cheney? And how do we know that Brandy Britton, one of your girls who committed suicide, didn't commit suicide?
Well, we don't know about that. There's two schools of thoughts. One says yes, one says no. But regarding Dick Cheney, he very possibly could have used the service. I don't remember him. I'm sure he used an alias.
This chilling phone call was recorded just 2 months before the D.C. Madam. The woman who could single-handedly take down Washington, D.C. was obviously murdered, similar to the way that people surrounding her died under mysterious circumstances. Back on May 3rd of 2008, Paul Joseph Watson wrote, "Evidence is stacking up to suggest that the alleged suicide of D.C. Madam Deborah Jean Palfrey was in fact a calculated murder, as the manager of Palfrey's Florida condo reveals that Palfrey was not suicidal when he spoke to her Monday and told him of her fears about a contract being out on her life." Watson continues, "The new testimony is backed up by at least 4 other recorded public statements on behalf of Palfrey, attesting to the fact that she would never commit suicide, and if she was found dead, to immediately suspect murder. She had been saying this since at least 1991. On May 6, 2008, Vanity Fair basically wrote Palfrey's obituary, catering to the District of Criminal Fears that her knowledge could expose. Vanity Fair painted her as a troubled woman on the path to suicide. D.C. Madam Deborah Jean Palfrey played a risky game in catering to Washington's power brokers with her upscale escort service. Her suicide this month marked a tragic and not unexpected end for a complicated woman who believed she was unfairly victimized. Following the death of Palfrey, Alex Jones appeared on Geraldo Rivera's show to sort out the details.
Joining me now from Austin, Texas, the well-known radio host himself, the conspiracy theorist and documentary filmmaker Alex Jones. Alex interviewed Deborah Palfrey in March of this year when she told him what you just heard, that she would never commit suicide. So Alex, welcome. What do you think? Do you believe this to be as the authorities say it is?
Geraldo, first off, thanks for having me on. She was a very nice lady, very genteel. There's no doubt in my mind that she was murdered. Let me just go through some of the basic evidence. She told me repeatedly on my radio show, and those interviews are posted at Infowars.com in full, that she would never kill herself, that she wasn't planning to kill herself. I pressed her during breaks in front of the board ops. I said, listen, this is dangerous. You've got to say who these people were. Do you know? And she said, well, I'm not going to say. I just want this all to end. And I said, you've got to say who it was or you're not safe. She said, listen, I'll never kill myself. If they claim that, I was murdered. So we have a tape of her saying she wouldn't commit suicide. Now, NBC in Florida, where she had a condo, is reporting that one of her friends, who was the manager of the high-rise condos, and he's on tape saying 2 days before she was killed, before she died, she left to her mother's and said, look, I'm being followed. I think there's a contract out on me. I'm not going to kill myself. This is on tape. Then you look at Brandy Britton. She was facing 6 months in jail last year, shot her mouth off, Miss Palfrey said, the D.C. Madam said, and said, I'm going to talk about who my Johns are. This is hypocritical. She was a professor. She had a psychology degree. She was saying, this is hypocritical. I'm going to tell who my Johns were, and then she hangs herself. Number one, Geraldo, you've covered a lot of criminology. You know, women don't normally hang themselves. First, one of her girls kills herself. Now she kills herself.
They take pills.
Exactly. And on top of it, in fact, 90% of women take pills. That's the way they do it. Now, men shoot themselves and hang themselves. It's just that she told her mother, she told the person that managed the condos where she lived, that she was friends with, everybody, that she was going to go on and going to fight. Others that knew her said that she was going to write a book when she got out in about 6 to 7 months. Could have been as many as 70 months, but certainly not 50 years, as some were saying. And you have 2 women hanging themselves. I mean, this is ridiculous with these supposed, very wealthy, very powerful Johns. I think this is, quote, taking out the garbage.
What do you say, Judge?
Well, I had the opportunity, Geraldo, to interview Deborah Jean about a year ago, and I talked to her about Brandy Britton and her suicide. And what she said to me is, they don't just come and get you, they terrorize you. But she made it very clear that she was not made of that. And I agree with you, Alex.
But not made of that means she was not suicidal.
She was not suicidal. She was a woman who had a very strong core. She was a fighter from the get-go. And one of the things she said to me, Geraldo, was that, look, this isn't about madams. This isn't about prostitution. This is about me. Suggesting that there was no government program to take down prostitutes. There was a program she believed to take her down. Think about it. You've got a top State Department official. You've got a military strategist, a United States senator. You've got all of these individuals, lobbyists, paying for prostitutes. At the same time, you've got the head of the Maryland State Police who's being indicted and convicted for using the Executive Protection Unit to move the prostitutes around. You've got a federal prosecutor at that time who was murdered and who yet his case is unsolved. You've got all kinds of corruption going on.
I think I was the first to receive the CDs with the raw copies of Gene Palfrey's telephone records, and they included Verizon and the Bell Telephone Company at the time, Chesapeake and Potomac, or Bell Atlantic. I recall that one number that I pretty well locked in belonged to somebody who had been an official with Pat Robertson, the televangelist. And another number went right back to the Centrex switch of the Bush-Cheney transition team in 2000, which was located in the West Building in McLean, Virginia. Now, that's of interest. I didn't get anybody's name because it's the central switch you get to when you call Bush-Cheney transition team headquarters. But we do know that Ted Cruz was one of the lawyers for the Bush team and the Bush versus Gore legal issues going on down in Florida at the time.
Yes.
So, and he was traveling back and forth because he had been with the Bush-Cheney campaign. He actually joined the Bush campaign in 1999 in Austin. So I would not be surprised whether there were calls from Ted Cruz to the escort service, either from his own cell phone or from Bush-Cheney transition team headquarters at the West Building in McLean, Virginia.
Montgomery Blair Sibley, Palfrey's former attorney, claims to have her phone records.
I'll start with the gag order. That was entered back in May of 2007. It was to prevent me from releasing any telephone numbers of the D.C. madam. It was partially modified to let me release telephone numbers alone, which we did, and that's how, through the crowdsource, we identified various people of prominence. Dan Moldea particularly identified Senator Vitter as one of the more prominent people on the list. Subsequent orders were entered in the case. Oral orders, which were never reduced to writing, never appear on the docket, were entered in the case. And the sum and substance of it all is, I understand and believe I'm operating on an order not to release the names of the escorts or the clients of the escort service as of this day.
Okay, now you appealed to you asked the Supreme Court to release this gag order. Tell us what happened with that.
Well, let me back up, if I could, David, just a bit more. It was in January that, for other reasons, I was looking at these records and believe they became relevant to the presidential election cycle we're in. So I first went to the court that issued the orders, gagging me, if you will, restraining me, and they refused to let me file a request to modify the orders. As a result, I went to the appellate court in D.C. and challenged that refusal of the right to even file the request to modify the restraining orders. After 2 weeks, waiting and hearing no response, and I'll just note it's now been 30 days and I still have had no response from the Circuit Court of Appeal. I then went to Chief Justice Roberts of the U.S. Supreme Court requesting his intervention in this matter. A large number of the numbers we couldn't identify. So I issued secret subpoenas, that is unknown to the government, to the major telephone companies asking them whose telephone numbers these are. And I gave them a list of about 6,000 telephone numbers. Those subpoenas went to Verizon Wireless, Alltel, AT&T, T-Mobile, and some others. And as a result, from Verizon Wireless, God bless them, they responded and gave me a list of 815 individuals and companies that had numbers in the telephone records of the escort service.
Okay, so you're able to reverse those out.
It's reverse engineering of the identities of the escorts and the customers of the escort service.
Have those names been released? Are there presidential candidates within those 815? Is that what you're trying to get released with these appeals to the court?
Well, David, let me be very clear in answering that compound question so there's no confusion. Those names have not been released because I believe they are under the court orders preventing me and everyone else who may think they have them or not have them from releasing those orders. If you do so, you're in violation of court order, which is contempt, which is punishable by incarceration. And there originally arguably was a good reason for those orders. My position now is that those reasons have dissipated, and alternatively, my First Amendment right to give comment now trumps whatever original reasons existed for issuing those orders, and therefore I properly have asked to be heard on my motion to dissolve those restraining orders. The government will not let me file that request, and that's what all the litigation is about.
Here we are, 8 years later, with a lid tightly sealed on the dirty little secrets that could cost Ted Cruz and countless career politicians their cozy little positions in a corporatocracy manipulated by the ability to compromise and blackmail. And of course, we just had asked Deborah Palfrey's lawyer what Alex Jones had asked her 8 years prior.
Let me ask you, you're not contemplating suicide, right?
Oh, let's go on the record about that.
Yeah, let's do that.
There's too much joy ahead of me in my life, and this is only part of my life, please, that isn't even a passing fancy of mine.